Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Al Capone's Beer Wars, A Complete History of Organized Crime in Chicago During Prohibition, by John J. Binder, narrated by David Colacci. Publisher's Note: This audiobook is packaged with bonus material, which has been included on the first audio and MP3 CD. If you downloaded this audiobook in a digital format, please visit Tantor.com and type Al Capone's Beer Wars into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then click on PDF Extra 1. When prompted, enter the access code VICE to access the bonus material. Preface. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John Adams. Since the 1920s, much has been written about gangland in Chicago during Prohibition. In fact, so much has appeared in print that the listener can be forgiven if he or she believes that it has all been done already. However, a careful examination of the literature shows that a complete history of the subject has yet to be written. The recent histories of the Chicago outfit had little to say about Prohibition. For example, Gus Russo devotes just 46 pages to the almost 100 years from 1837 to 1932. Similarly, in terms of bootlegging, Robert Lombardo covers the Prohibition era in roughly 20 pages. Neither volume contains any major new research on the bootleggers and their era. Broader books on Chicago's underworld are also incomplete accounts of the dry era. John Landesco's highly commendable study, which is the first academic research done on organized crime, in Chicago or anywhere else, only extends to the middle of 1928. This is probably because he was under extreme time pressure to complete his work for publication in 1929 as part of the Illinois Crime Survey. In the process, Landesco discusses most of organized crime in Chicago from 1905 to 1928, although he does not mention narcotics trafficking, labor racketeering, outside of its use of bombing as a tool, or policy gambling. He also tends to survey a variety of specific events, as opposed to chronicling the broader evolution of each racket. Other works that appeared before the repeal of Prohibition focus on the most sensational, and therefore the most violent, incidents during the dry era in Chicago. These include the drive-by shooting at the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the murders of Dean O'Banion, Earl Jaime Weiss, the Jenna brothers, William McSwiggan, Diamond Joe Esposito, and Jake Lingle. The famous booklet X Marks the Spot by Hal Andrews is also incident-driven, although it provides a somewhat broader look at the world of bootlegging. Herbert Asbury and Virgil Peterson cover the history of organized crime in Chicago beginning in the 1800s. However, each volume devotes only about 60 pages to the Prohibition era. In fact, Asbury barely mentions 1931, and the focus is heavily on the Capone gang and once again on the most interesting violence. Although Kenneth Alsop's work is entirely devoted to Chicago's bootleggers, on that subject his book does not go beyond 1930. These authors also retell the dry-era stories that receive so much attention from earlier writers without bringing anything new to the table. The Capone biographies, not surprisingly, deal largely with Alphonse Capone and his gang. In terms of the gang wars, they are primarily interested in Capone's mob, its allies, and its most important enemies, and they go little beyond the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. These books are also rooted in the tradition of telling the story primarily by recounting the most interesting murders. Mars Agigian's masterful biography of Capone's successor Francesco Nitto, a.k.a. Frank Nitti, contains much information on organized crime during the time period in question, yet the focus on its intended subject, Frank Nitti, does not allow it to cover all aspects of Chicago's underworld. The emphasis on major gang killings and attempted murders, which runs through most of the literature on the underworld in Chicago and elsewhere, regardless of the era, is likely because these events are fascinating in their own right. Admittedly, they often contribute to the larger view because the deaths of gang leaders frequently affected the outcomes in gang wars in major ways, although the murders of reporters and politicians played no part in that. But this focus shifts attention away from the important issues of how the various gangs during Prohibition arose, expanded and contracted, and sometimes fell. It also misrepresents the violence in various ways. For example, many of the most famous events are spectacular because the Thompson submachine gun was used in them, giving the impression that this weapon was far and away the most common tool in the gangland arsenal. However, a careful examination of gangland killings indicates that it was in fact used quite infrequently during the dry era, even in Chicago, where it was introduced into the underworld. And this emphasis on violence shifts attention away from what the gangs were really doing, running illegal businesses to enrich the members. In what has been written to date, many of the major bootlegging gangs are barely discussed or are not mentioned at all, and parts of the gang wars receive little or no attention. Also, there is no accurate map showing the areas controlled by the bootlegging mobs in Chicago at a given point in time, much less multiple maps that illustrate changes in the landscape over time. Therefore, there is no full history of Prohibition-era organized crime in and around Chicago. Similarly, the story of how the Torrio Capone gang, which was one of a dozen bootlegging mobs in Chicago at the start of the time period, with an often minor presence in other rackets, came to control virtually all of the city's underworld in 1934, has not yet been told. Furthermore, there has not been a full treatment of the evolution of prostitution, gambling, labor racketeering, business racketeering, and narcotics trafficking, what organized crime consisted of before Prohibition, and what it returned to afterward. There has not even been a complete discussion of the business aspects of bootlegging in the books to date. Frankly, the essence of organized crime in the dry era is missing in much of what has been written. This book hopes to remedy the situation by providing a complete history of Chicago's underworld during Prohibition. It covers not only the bootlegging and the fighting between the bootlegging gangs, but also the other important rackets that existed before and during the dry era. To that end, it begins with a discussion of organized crime before 1920 and examines the evolution of those activities over time. In terms of the bootlegging gangs and the gang wars, while it covers the details as necessary, it concentrates more heavily on the broader picture. It also examines the effects of law enforcement and politics on the underworld, especially how the authorities and various citizens groups fought organized crime, a topic that has not received the attention it deserves. In the process, this book refutes a number of myths and misconceptions about the gangs, the gang wars, and the rackets in Chicago. I've used a variety of resources to tell the story. First and foremost are the major Chicago newspapers, which even at this late date have still not been fully examined. The crime reporters in Chicago were experts in their field, and were generally very well informed about what was going on in the underworld, partly because some of them had one foot in that world. They also had important contacts in the upper world, especially with the police. Various inaccuracies that have arisen over the years can often be corrected based on newspaper articles alone. There are also a number of official records that are important in this history, such as material in the files of the Chicago Crime Commission, CCC, Chicago Police Department, CPD, crime statistics, reports, and ballistic tests done in conjunction with the department, as well as investigations into prostitution and gambling conducted by private agencies such as the Juvenile Protection Association, JPA, and the Committee of 15. A variety of genealogical records, including birth and death certificates, have also been examined to better understand who the criminals and the victims really were. Finally, over the years I have been contacted by scores of relatives of Chicago organized crime figures. Usually they were seeking information about the careers of their gangster kin, because when they were growing up not a single word was said about it in their home. However, in several cases they and other informed individuals had interesting details and more which they were willing to share. I have used that material when it was credible, either because it was well documented or it was supported by other facts. Chapter 1. Before Prohibition. I have been welcomed to many friendly doors, by beauties too. Why do I keep in mind your greeting, Minnie, to your festal floors, above so many hospitable and kind? The dullness, darkness of Chicago nights drove youth to seek the brilliance of your house, where there were music, dancing, and delights, and girls in silk with snood upon their brows. Girls who have lived through much of false and true, of this world's folly, in and out of luck, and who had found reality and knew how much it is, how little it is to F. blank. Edgar Lee Masters. Minnie Everly. Unpublished poem, 1941. The story of the Chicago outfit, which dominated organized crime in the Chicago area at the end of Prohibition and reached far beyond Illinois, begins with James "Big Jim" Colosimo. Born Vincenzo Colosimo in 1878 in the town of Colosimi, which is located in the hardscrabble region of Calabria in the toe of the Italian boot, he came to Chicago in 1891. Perhaps Colosimo planned to earn a tidy sum and return to Italy to live a life of relative comfort. Perhaps he hoped to prosper and stay in the United States. Regardless of his intentions, even in his wildest dreams Colosimo would never have imagined that the criminal enterprise he started, which John Torrio and Al Capone later ran, would eventually become the most successful of the Cosa Nostra crime families. Chicago in the late 1800s was Colosimo's green pasture. It was still very much a wide-open frontier town. The Great Lakes region was a sparsely populated wilderness until the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which greatly reduced the costs of shipping between the upper Midwest and the East Coast. People from the Northeast and Europe flowed to the shores of Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, and, in return, produce flowed from there and the adjoining areas via the lakes, canals, and later railroads to the Atlantic coast. Chicago was unusually well situated to take part in that trade, whatever the method of transportation, and its location served the city well again during Prohibition. From before the Civil War until the early 1900s, the region encompassing the Great Lakes was known as the West rather than the Midwest. Long after 1900, the predecessor of the Big Ten Conference in college athletics was still called the Western Conference. The region was Western rather than Eastern in character as well, growing and advancing rather than staid and settled. Its values were those of the frontier and the individual, with an emphasis on self-reliance, including in the handling of disagreements, and an acceptance in some quarters of the use of force to settle disputes. The majority of Chicago's immigrants came from continental Europe. Many brought with them a belief, based on the semi-feudal nature of the world in which they had been raised, that the system was there to be exploited by individuals for their personal gain, as opposed to the idea that individuals worked for the common good. After all, for years many of them and their families had been dominated by the nobility in their homeland. Unlike Boston, New York, and Philadelphia on the eastern seaboard, or even Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, river towns that were all established and thrived much earlier, these ideas pervaded Chicago. For years, this mindset created a tolerance in the city and the surrounding areas of activities that were strongly frowned upon elsewhere, as evidenced by the long and continuing history of political chicanery in Illinois. These characteristics made Chicago a fertile ground for organized crime, with the city's motto, "I will," which indicates an anything-is-possible attitude, often meaning anything goes. Organized crime in Chicago began long before Colosimo's arrival, and therefore well before Prohibition. The first Frenchman to step out of a canoe and permanently reside in Chicago, Pierre Moreau, brought liquor with him, and immediately violated the ordinance against selling alcohol to Native Americans in France's colonies. Gambling and prostitution were certainly well established in the city by at least the mid-1830s. However, before James Colosimo became an underworld powerhouse, organized crime was small in scale and highly specialized. For example, one group of individuals dealt almost exclusively in gambling. From 1876 to the mid-1890s, illegal betting in Chicago was controlled by Michael Cassius, a.k.a. Mike McDonald. He syndicated gambling and was therefore the man who had to be paid by anyone engaging in the gambling business. During the McDonald era, illegal betting centered on table games such as faro and roulette. As the leader of the saloon keepers and the sporting elements, McDonald was a major power in Chicago politics. He closely advised several mayors who were Democrats, causing one newspaper to ask, "Is Carter Harrison or Mike McDonald mayor of Chicago?" Due to his clear understanding of the links between organized crime and politics, McDonald is generally regarded as the first powerful figure in the Chicago underworld. He retired around 1894 after a wave of reform challenged the gambling establishments. Various stories about Mike McDonald, such as the following, illustrate his disregard for the law. "We're raising a little money, Mike," a man who came into his gambling den said, taking up a collection. "We'd like to put you down for $2. "What's it for?" asked McDonald. "Well, we're burying a policeman." "Fine," said Mike. "Here's $10. Bury 5 of 'em." A second story demonstrates McDonald's political connections and acumen. After he bribed the necessary public officials, the American Stone and Brick Preserving Company, the McDonald Front, was awarded a contract to apply a secret preserving fluid to the county courthouse. When the job was finished in December 1886, the county was presented with a bill for $128,250. The preserving fluid was a thoroughly useless mixture of chalk and water. The arrests for gambling and separately for prostitution, referred to in what follows as vice, in Chicago per annum from 1875 to 1973, along with the city's population, measured in thousands, are reported in the first panel of the table in Figure 1.3 in the bonus PDF. The arrest data are from the CPD's annual reports. The number of arrests per capita, referred to as the Gambling and Vice Indexes, are standardized to equal 100 in 1920. The numerator of each index equals the number of offenses committed multiplied by the percentage of offenses that led to an arrest. Therefore, if the number of offenses per capita was constant, the index would indicate how the enforcement of the relevant laws, due to mayoral policy and public pressure, changed over time. The second panel of the table reports the average values of the indexes for each mayor during his consecutive years in office. Gambling arrests per capita in Chicago were relatively low before the turn of the century. The gambling index was greater than the long-term average of 57 in only 2 of those years. Clearly, early Chicagoans were fairly tolerant of games of chance. Otherwise, their mayors would have cracked down on them as hard as the later ones did. Some of the mayors before 1900, such as Hempstead Washburn and George Swift, did work to suppress illegal betting, while Mike McDonald's ally, Mayor Carter Harrison Sr., had quite a bit of difficulty finding it inside the city limits. In fact, the gambling index was at a historical low during Harrison's initial 8 years in office. Refer to the second panel of the table in Figure 1.3 in the bonus PDF, with an average value of 22. For example, only 217 gambling arrests were made in 1879, when the city's population was nearly 500,000. Enforcement during this time period was generally more lax when the mayor was a Democrat instead of a Republican. For example, from 1875 to 1899, the average value of the index was 49 when a Republican was the mayor, but only 27 when a Democrat was in office. The reform movement of the early 1890s dissipated, and in 1897 Carter Harrison Jr. returned Chicago to the wide-open town policy. During the younger Harrison's first period as mayor, the gambling index had an average value of 41. By this point in time, the emphasis of illegal betting had shifted somewhat away from table games and more heavily toward bookmaking on horse racing, with the bets taken in gambling dens, handbooks operating throughout the city and in pool rooms. Customers of the handbooks included lawyers, doctors, writers, waiters, chauffeurs, and businessmen, as well as, it was admitted, pimps and thieves and thugs. At the time, 4 separate groups dominated gambling in the city. The South Side faction was led by James O'Leary, son of the Mrs. O'Leary whose cow was falsely blamed for the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. O'Leary worked out of a stockade on South Halsted, which one newspaper article describes, with some exaggeration, as fireproof, bomb-proof, burglar-proof, and police-proof. Although the walls were solid and the doors were made of steel and oak, it was in fact raided by the police many times. The downtown Loop area was controlled by a group led by John O'Malley, Patrick O'Malley, Tom McGinnis, and First Ward Alderman Michael Hinky-Dink Kenna and John Bathhouse Coughlin. On the north side, Mont Tennis and his brothers William and Edward were in charge, while on the west side, a group allied with Tennis, which included Alderman Johnny Rogers, held sway. The political situation changed in the early 1900s when Edward Dunn became mayor. A Democrat but also a reformer, he waged a vigorous campaign against organized crime, including gambling. Dunn's policy deviated from the prevailing practice of the Republicans advocating good government and the closed town. In 1906, during Mayor Dunn's last year in office, the total revenue of the gamblers in Chicago was $15 million, with between $12 and $13 million coming from horse racing and the rest from other types of wagering. Republican Fred Bussey, who succeeded Dunn, was essentially the first mayor from his party, but not the last, to let the town run wide open. Although gambling was rampant at the time, with Chicago regarded as the pinnacle of handbook betting in the country, enforcement declined dramatically in the city from 1906 to 1910, as the gambling index dropped from 140 to 25. The various gambling factions coexisted fairly peacefully until Mont Tennis obtained a Chicago monopoly in 1905 on the horse racing results supplied by the Payne News Service of Cincinnati, and charged his rivals a monopoly price for the service, namely, half of the profits from their racetrack betting. No gambling house making book on horse races could operate without the instantaneous results from tracks around the country that this service provided. On the one hand, winning bettors wanted to be paid quickly, and the house wanted to move on to the next race. On the other hand, bookies who had delayed information could be taken to the cleaners by bettors who knew the results before they did. Tennis was allied at the time with John O'Malley, McGinnis, and Loop gambler John Condon against a group led by O'Leary. Tennis's rivals responded with violence in June 1907, and from that point through October 1909, 33 gambling-related bombings occurred. Mont Tennis was attacked at the onset of the hostilities while walking with his wife, and his properties, including his home, were bombed 4 different times. John Rogers's saloon at Madison and May was bombed twice, as was John O'Malley's, and Condon's home was hit as well. In retaliation, O'Leary's Halstead Street headquarters was damaged by explosions on 3 occasions. When the dust finally settled, Tennis had essentially won a complete victory over his enemies that gave him local control of the racing news. He soon reached a higher level of power and dominance by founding his own General News Bureau, driving the Payne service out of business as his agency gained a national monopoly in the provision of racing results. Tennis sold the News Bureau in the late 1920s to Moses Annenberg, Jack Lynch, and others. In 1911, Carter Harrison, Jr., supported by the gambling interests, returned to office. Because Harrison favored the open town, little changed after he replaced the gambling-friendly Bussey. In fact, gamblers from various parts of the United States flocked to Chicago after the election. The city was soon divided into 3 large zones, each controlled by a czar who dispensed gambling and vice privileges. Those who wanted to operate on the south side, between Madison Street and 63rd Street, had to first get permission from Hinky-Dink Kenna. He was the linchpin in the system, given his close ties to the younger Mayor Harrison, which explains why he owned so many gambling operations directly. Politician Barney Grogan controlled the west side, while Hot Stove Jimmy Quinn, a former protege of Tennis, controlled the north side. Quinn and his relatives also ran the gambling at the Riverview Amusement Park on the north side. Frank Solon and politician Tom Carey, who presided over the area south of 39th Street, aided Kenna. North Side Alderman Herman Bowler and Herman Lutzenkirchen had the Rogers Park area and the remainder of the far north and northwest sides. They worked under Quinn, while politician Manny Abrahams controlled the Maxwell Street district. The protection money the gamblers paid so they could operate unmolested flowed through these men to the police and other politicians, with plainclothes police officers who were the personal men of the lieutenants and other higher-ups doing the actual collecting. An inquiry led by federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis in 1916 revealed that the group of 12 to 15 handbooks in Chicago, directly owned by Tennis, handled from $6,000 to $7,000 in bets per day and turned a net profit of approximately $54,000 per year. In addition, profits to Tennis and his partners from the General News Bureau amounted to nearly $270,000 per year. Further net income, albeit not reported or estimated, was generated by casino gambling. Although no precise figure for the citywide profits from all types of gambling was ever calculated for 1911, an admittedly rough estimate for Chicago is $4.1 million. The lottery game known as policy was active in Chicago decades before Prohibition. Contrary to assertions that it was invented or introduced by Patsy King or Policy Sam Young in the 1890s, policy games were running in Chicago long before 1890. For example, one old-time Chicagoan remembered the game operating in Morton's Policy Shop, across from the old Chicago Tribune building in the era of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, while an article states that the game was active before the Great Fire. It was also thriving in the Windy City and across the country during the 1870s. Policy was certainly being played in New York City in the 1850s, and it is mentioned by newspapers there before 1820. Therefore, neither King nor Young brought the game to the city, although Young might have been the first to operate in the African-American community, which later became its stronghold. In the modern form of the game, numbers from 1 to 78 were placed in a drum. A bettor, playing a gig.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?